Hi, I'm Marguerite Rowe. I'm State Director for AARP Washington. Welcome to our next segment of Caring for Caregivers Conversations. We're really fortunate today to have Richard Louie with us. Richard, I know you identify yourself as a journalist often, but from what I can tell, you are an author, an entrepreneur, maybe a tech genius somewhere in there?
No genius, for sure. Good to be here with you, Marguerite, and thank you for having these conversations.
Yeah, you're actually here today to do a town hall event,
Right.
Talking about caregiving and brain health for your documentary Unconditional. But I know you have done other things as well, and so I thought we might delve into some of these other things, like Sky Blossom, for instance.
Yeah. I think other things, when you bring that up, the first thing that sort of pops into my brain is not going to college. Like, what have I done? It's also what I have not done that might be defining for me without knowing at the time that it was. And when I decided not to go to college, it was because I didn't find education very edifying. I didn't find it very, I wasn't getting a lot of return out of it. So I worked at Mrs. Fields for 4 years, and I learned a lot.
They're good cookies.
Doggone it, they are. And I did that for 4 years, and it was some of the best years in business that I've ever had. And I'm so glad that I did it. I then went to City College of San Francisco after that, because I took a while for me to kind of marinate and realize that's what I wanted to do. So I think making the decisions not to do certain things can be defining about what you do decide to do.
But in terms of sort of other influences in your life, your father was a pastor, is that correct?
Pastor, a social worker. He wanted to be a pastor. He grew up in Chinatown, San Francisco. And so, secret here, youth pastors don't make enough to raise a family with 4 kids. And so he had to change his job because basically mom was going, hello, we got 2 at the time, and then 3 and then 4. So he became a social worker, which is the next highest paying job in America outside of youth pastor. And he made that decision and stuck with it for the rest of his career, despite that we were living on the poverty line, and he, who would give away food stamps to his clients, also himself had to get another social worker to walk with him to the office to get food stamps. And that was one of the defining moments, I think, in our family, and especially for me being young and us not having a lot of food and going to, the proverbial going to sleep hungry and being pretty upset as a kid. But also knowing that they made the decision, both of them, to take on jobs that made so little. And like when my mom, as a school teacher, we had to really squeeze this out of her, but she would sometimes, or somebody would mention one of her friends. Oh, Rose, we hear that they asked you to get a promotion to become vice principal of X school, nicer area in the city, higher pay. And we're like, hey, Mom, that's great. You deserve it. Yeah, I didn't take it. And we're like, why didn't you take it, Mom? It's not like we're rolling in the dough, right? We're not. And she didn't say it this way, but this is what she was saying, is I'm a school teacher. This is what I want to do. I want to teach children. And she lived that until her last job before she retired, because she had a choice which school she wanted to retire at. And she, along with some of the other most experienced teachers in the school district of San Francisco, chose the most difficult elementary school, the lowest scores with the most violence. And that said a lot to me. 10 years later. At the time, I just thought, boy, my parents just are not good decision makers. But in the end, what drove me to the other things you're talking about in my career and the decisions I made was really this sort of thing happening in the back of my brain without me knowing it, and in my heart as well without knowing it, that there's some things that you must do, and it may mean making some sacrifices. For them, they knew as civil servants, that's what they had to do.
So you talk a little bit about your history and your growing up in Enough About Me, your book, which is really around selflessness.
What a topic.
Well, you know what? So what spurred you to do that sort of deep journey to look inside? That's unusual for most people. That's not something that we all like to do.
I mean, we've known each other for about half a year, right? And you wouldn't necessarily meet me and say, "Oh, that's Mr. Selfless." And certainly, I'm no more selfless than other people are. But what drove me to go to that topic was after years of caregiving for my father. And I was talking with the book agent. And first of all, I was very grateful for Brandy to come over to me and say, "Hey, we know that you're doing all this caregiving, and we think there's a message in here. We don't know what it is, but it may not be caregiving, right? Because we've looked at other caregiving books out there. They just aren't being picked up by people for some reason. Maybe we need to go a little bit higher on the hierarchy, not meaning one or better, but just higher in terms of the idea that the umbrella that fits over it." And they said, well, we came down with selflessness. And at the time, I said, that's the idea. Because as a journalist, I was covering what I later termed as the selfish pandemic. When I was sitting at the anchor desk and covering so many breaking stories around violence against other people because of the color of their skin. When I was covering story after story of communities getting gunned down, children in Newtown, Connecticut, for instance, and I was on the anchor desk that day. When I was covering a community in El Paso, Texas, because of their color of their skin, there was a big shooting in El Paso. And I kept on doing that, week after month after year. There was a selfish pandemic. We believed that because you're not like me, you don't say the things I say, I have the right, not only to be right, I have the right to take your life. And so when all of that happened along with the political ire that I also covered as a journalist and anchor, we're living in the selfish pandemic. And so my drive towards doing a book about selflessness was to take an age-old golden rule discussion, but bring it up to date for today. I'm not obviously this great thinker around it, but I am a reporter on it. And so what I tried to do in Enough About Me was dig into modern research, today's research, because I'm a business book kind of person. I really love business books, self-help business books. And I tried to apply that layer and what we are today to that idea, to that very idea.
So I also like business books, and I'm also fascinated with thinking of and learning from business leaders who've really set new trends, right? And so right now, if you were to pick up any newspaper, you would see Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, who's the CEO, who, when he talks about building his business, one of the things that I thought was most interesting was when he said, we're building for what is yet to come and needing to create the market and catalyzing or spurring the market so that our product would meet that need. And so I think about that opportunity in caregiving, and I think, okay, we know it's an issue, and we know that we have, in Washington, we have 820,000 unpaid family caregivers who we absolutely need their support.
And untrained.
And those numbers are only going to grow. So how do we create the market for caregiving?
Yeah, I think I'm so appreciative of your example. When I was in business school, I was a city banker before and worked in tech for the first half of my working career. And the philosophy that was given to me by my mentors was to be market focused, not company focused or organization focused. And your very example, I think, is spot on. We got to know the market better. If we're going to try to help the caregiving space, we must really know the space well. The issue is we don't. We don't understand the market and the segments of what caregiving is. An example of what we can do today, one of the ideas I really want to work on and I'm trying to gather interest around, is the caregiving genome. Just the way we had the human genome, the very structure of the way you and I are built.
Sure.
When that came out and it was introduced to the world as, no cost to you, right? Open source. Then what we had are these miraculous devices and products and services that we had never seen before for us. When it comes to the caregiving genome, we are missing the contextual usage case of caregiving services and products. And we have a lot of great energy and hearts and brains out there.
Yep.
But what we don't have is the understanding of the real-time application of these services and products.
So, we had a conversation recently at ARP about sort of the digital transformation of what's happening.
Yep.
And one of the ideas that comes up oftentimes that I hear about are like, robot dogs or putting in place like AI-generated tech devices that, from my perspective, you could build a business around, but would also lead to more social isolation. So I'm trying to understand how do we find that niche that you're talking about, that market, in what I think of as, and maybe it's being maternalistic in my case, of wanting to protect older adults too, and those who tend to be more vulnerable.
Yes, and I think it's definitely one of those instincts, and also paternal and also human, I hope, right? To protect those who need the help and are not getting it. The idea of the caregiving genome is that we can understand when an older adult might be feeling that way. We'll know by the number of breaths they're taking, by the number of times they get up, by the number of times they drink a glass of water or do not. And we will know that across thousands of cases with all the wearables, and this is where we can use AI to analyze audio and video in ways that is so easy for us today. That if you wanted to know when a certain caregiving recipient was feeling that way, you would have the data real time to say,
It's true.
I'm worried about mom, because guess what she did today? She only got up twice.
It's true.
At this time or that time.
I will say, it's sort of fascinating, right? Because we are in an era where you could videotape a person's entire life, right? You could capture every aspect of it. There is both.
But we don't have the data on what that video means, is my point.
That's true. That's true.
Now you throw it into this engine, it will crunch that data for us, and you and I aren't sitting down like we used to have to do that before. And we can cross-correlate it with things like your vitals.
I think that the challenge, and I'll bring another sort of reference from today, right? Is the movie Oppenheimer, frankly, right? Where you have researchers and scientists.
I heard of it, I think.
Who are, you're gaining new knowledge and new discovery. And one of the big challenges, and this is, not to be a commentary on Oppenheimer, but is the question around the social policy around that kind of research and discovery. Have you given some thought around what does that mean to, because I can see the idea, right? A caregiving genome. And I don't know if it's best done with in partnerships with like universities and communities and so forth. But how do you think about some of those aspects around the social policy? Because, at ARP, we do a lot to protect folks around fraud and scams. And I think privacy and wanting to make sure that people remain, safe.
I think the structures can be put in place. And so similar to the human genome, where it started with a paper and then a paper being introduced and then a collection of thinkers and governments, and it kept on moving, and then that can be put in place. And clearly we need to protect that. The idea of the caregiving genome is not only about the caregiving recipient, it's also about the caregiver. Mm-hmm. So both would be, in that idea of big data, we'd have both of those sets in there. Because it's a correlation that you can use just for the caregiving recipient, but there's also, as you know, we need to focus on the caregiver. And when we're able to not only do crosstabs on each group within themselves, we can also do crosstabs between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not going to be impossible to do. It's so easier for us to do today. And the idea is so that when we have all these great thinkers today, their new idea in the caregiving space does not die in 2 years.
So, and maybe you've already answered this question, but let's say in the next 3 years or in the next 5 years, given what we've just talked about, what are you most excited about, or what do you think is sort of at hand?
The most important is that we are in a phase of society and business and community that we have never been in before. And caregiving is at a point of awareness and understanding that at a level we've never seen before. Mm-hmm. Whether we talk about it, activate it, whether we're able to reap the great wealth of understanding this globally, I don't know the answer. But I do know that post-COVID, this past 5 years, the struggles we all had as humans has shown us that caring for another is something I have a story personally now.
Yeah.
Every single person around the world
absolutely
has a caregiving story at the ready. And businesses, and that's why I mentioned businesses, also have stories as businesses of caregiving being part of their business. We've never had that before.
So let me slightly switch, but go off on a slightly different tangent.
So I'm hopeful.
Yep.
Very hopeful. The market is wide open. More than it ever has been.
The market is wide open for a lot of things, right? Because we truly are at a different place with technology. But I will say with technology has come a shift in communication. And I at least in terms of how I think people are willing to, how much they're willing to read, what they're willing to hear. Mm-hmm. Everything comes in short sound bites now, and everything, and one of their biggest challenges is getting people to recognize themselves as caregivers, and also to act on understanding that caregiving is not just a personal journey, but it's actually a societal journey that we have to take just because of the age wave. Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a culture gap in the space of understanding this. How we communicate the messages and share the stories that bring us past that culture gap, whether it be short or long messaging, as you brought up, is a mix. What we often will do societally is glom onto things because they're interesting now. Mm-hmm. So how many times have you heard AI in the last year?
A lot.
So that is a great example. 20 years ago, it was .com.
That's true.
Be very aware, as we all are, that yes, it's real, it's part of what we're going through, but it's not everything. It is not everything, nor are short messaging platforms. They're good, they're great, they work, but they're not the only platform. An example, when you look at the nightly news broadcast that every network has, ABC, CBS, NBC, at 6:30 p.m., more or less across the country, it was said every year for the last 20 years that it is the end of that broadcast. The numbers for that broadcast on every network has stayed steady.
Oh.
And what has happened, 5 to 6 million for each one, has stayed steady. What has grown over time are the other platforms, short messaging, digital, OTT, nonlinear space, right? So that doesn't mean that the other ways of getting these messages across are gone. They're not. So all of these ways need to be considered in adjusting the way we understand what culture is, and part of what culture is today is caregiving. So the way that is addressed is indeed more complex than it was before. That is the difference. But it's not simplistic, just like we often are. It's not a 1 or 0. So not everything is all about AI today.
You know, one of the things that we do at AARP is we do a lot of advocacy work. We work both in Washington, D.C., we work here locally in Olympia, to try to compel policy advancements, you know, social and changing structural programs and so forth. Is there something that you think that as communities that we, and you know, say advocates or the general population, how can we do better in communicating this urgency? Because I think it's urgent around caregiving, like to compel governments to act.
I do not, as a journalist, do not advocate in this function for any specific piece of legislation, nor do I advocate for any specific policy change. What I am advocating as I sit here with you is a cultural change. And I think that those that might be a sweet spot to address this very conversation around change and evolution of the understanding of what caregiving is are all the groups, but the one group that understand the full arc of what caregiving might be, a cycle of caregiving, because you might, like I'm going through my second cycle with my mom, and I had the first cycle with my father, and are those who've gone through a cycle, because typically they understand the full arc, number one. Number two, if they are not beginning a second cycle, they have the time and energy to help discuss this and offer advice and sit with those who are thinking about change in culture. The ones who are in the middle of the cycle we are absolutely up to here. We have no bandwidth, we have no time, we have lots of ideas and lots of perspective. So I think one way is to engage with those who have gone through and now are no longer actively caregiving. The one thing that never changes, the analogy I bring up is astronauts. Astronauts randomly, luckily, sometimes get chosen. They go on a mission, they get in this little silo, they get to choose who is going to help them go on the mission. They blast up into the sky. They get all these sort of last-minute problems and emergencies, and it's up to the team to try to help to fix it. It might be a hole in the hull, right? It might be that the oxygen generator is out, right? It's not, the water the water filter isn't working. They have to work to fix it. And, you know, it might be that they can't figure out what the right direction is. Then they get to the moon. They finally, we got there, yeah. And then they return to Earth. And when they come back, they're always called astronauts. The title always is an astronaut. Caregivers are the same. They're put in that silo. They have those that help them. They go through their mission. And they make it, right? They care for their loved one. And then when it's over, they come back. And just like when astronauts come back and they're sort of lost, it's been, talked about and researched, so are our caregivers too. But we never lose the title of caregiver. And so if there's a place to understand those who might be able to give more time based on what they're doing at that time and still understand the space, if you're looking about changing culture and understanding the space and trying to get it out there and helping this idea as team members,
Yeah.
it would be those astronauts.
You know, I think when, I know we've talked a little bit about culture change before. I will say that I think that in this sort of era of political divide and everything, that the caregiving journey is one, while it's unique personally,
Yes.
is so shared. It is sort of, you know, my hope that we can actually bridge some of these divides that that are sort of social artifacts
Yes.
that we've created.
Yeah, they're social artifacts. They are current barriers and walls as well. They're all mixed together, right? Which you understand in your experience. Caregiving, in the 7 years that I've been interviewing and covering the topic and talking about the topic, both in community, in the advocacy space, you know, talking to organizations like yours about what you're doing in policy and in legislation, as well as in business and offering ideas. What can businesses do in this space to engage and understand and be productive? Is, you know, there are a few things that you could say is the secret sauce or the ketchup of life. Making it taste good, right? Everybody uses ketchup everywhere, just about. That's caregiving.
Yeah.
And you can take two people at the beginning of the day that absolutely don't like each other. They hate each other because of the color of their skin or whatever it is. You sit them next to each other and talk about caregiving. Doesn't matter if they're 14 and you're 50. Doesn't mean if you're from Siberia and the other's from Burma. You have that moment. And I've seen it over and over again. It's the ketchup.
Yeah. So one of you, beyond Unconditional, you also did another documentary.
Yes.
Called Sky Blossom,
Yeah.
which followed younger adults, teenagers.
Yes.
In caring.
Yep.
By any chance, did you keep following that, or have you been in touch with them?
I have.
Do you know, how are those families?
So Sky Blossom followed children as caregivers, family caregivers. And most people will say, it's you and me that are the caregivers. That's our age group, right? And yes, we are. But we're not the whole story. And so we have followed 5 different family caregivers for 3 years, and they're all doing okay. One of the child caregivers, Rihanna Alvarado in Long Beach, California, I just visited them 2 weeks ago. And she was taking care of her father in the film. And her father had 2 or 3 different types of cancer, one of which required him to have a trach and a feeding tube. And he lost a lot of weight. He was under 100. And they would go walking, and because of the cancer that he got in service of our country, people would point at him, you know, look at him.
Right.
And Rihanna would go to her father, when she was walking with her father, Brian, when she saw this, she would tell people, you turn around. Stop. It's my dad.
Yeah.
And she was, when we interviewed her, she was, I think, 11 years old. And she also understood what that bullying nature was about, because she's on the spectrum. And she, at school, would often get what her dad was getting in the streets. And that strength taught us a lot about caregiving and the strength and the power it has. Her father passed away 2 weeks ago.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Yeah. And I'm worried about Rihanna, and I'm worried about, as well, Rocio, who's the mother. But they are strong and such great people that the story of Brian Alvarado and the Alvarados in the film Sky Blossom is one of utter, I call that generation, the Rihannas of the world, the next greatest generation. They're from a military family on top of that. And you can tell from the story I've told you here that you understand Marguerite. She is going to be a great leader
Absolutely.
in our communities, Rihanna Alvarado.
Absolutely.
And that film brings to reality that indeed she is a caregiver. And there are 5 million Rihanna Alvarados in America. Not just you and me. There are 5 million. There are 53 million or more, all said. But wait, she's 11 years old. How can, exactly. This is something that crosses all society. 25 million are millennial or younger.
Right. We have a group of volunteers here at AARP, some of them who are very involved in kinship care.
Mm-hmm.
So, grandparents or aunties and uncles who are taking care of young kids.
Uh-huh.
But because of their age, that situation in caregiving is going to flip really, will flip, where the young people have to also care for their grandparents or their aunts and uncles. It also made me think a lot about what we are facing now with both coming out of this phase of the COVID pandemic and with the opioid epidemic and having to support those children as they are caring for their loved ones. But I'll just say, thank you for making that film, because it was very touching.
Thank you for saying that. It was the one that I thought was so important, because we had 5 children from 5 different regions of our country during a time where we think, if you're from this part and I'm from that part, we're not alike, right?
Yeah.
And all 5 of them, as you know, represented different ethnic backgrounds: indigenous, white, Latino, Black, API. And what you saw in the movie was, oh, wait, that did not matter in this case. And so there are so many ways to understand through caregiving the ketchup analogy, that it really does bring us together in so many different ways. And the thing about that very idea of children and caregiving is, indeed, we don't have a lot of academic research in that space. We've done a lot with older caregivers, our age or older or whatever, but we don't have it about the children. Yeah. When we went out looking for the experts in understanding that space, there's very, very little to nothing. So that's an opportunity.
Well, I'm just going to say, there are so many more conversations that I would love to have with you.
Ketchup?
Ketchup. And
wait till my mustard analogy. How about that one?
I really want to thank you for coming to Seattle, for being with us here at AARP Washington.
Oh, you bet.
And just appreciate the optimism that you bring and sort of the visionary, thinking about caregiving. That is what we need. We need to harness people behind you to catch up with where you are.
There you go. Nice pun. One thing on that, finally, as we close up here, is that has been the approach of these projects that we've undertaken around caregiving, the 2 films and other work that we've done, is because I was going through it and I was learning how, and what I say often, I learned how to cry in different ways, but I also learned how to laugh in different ways.
Yeah.
And the thing about caregiving, as many caregivers know out there, is that you find joy despite difficulty. And that was our mantra every day for 7 years as we were going through these film projects, is that in all of these stories, in all of these families, there was joy despite difficulty. And that is so true about caregiving. And I'm very careful to say this. I am not the best person around, but after my dad passed 2 years ago, as I was thinking about what I'd gone through, it was not only a mental health journey, it was also something at the end of the day, I believe, though I'm not the best person in the world, that I am the best human I've ever been.
I appreciate that. And we are so fortunate to have you join us here. For more information around caregiving, please go to www.aarp.org. www.caregivers.org/caregivers.wa, Caregivers WA for Caregivers Washington. Thanks very much. Appreciate having you here with us.
Thanks, Marguerite.